Now, as John Darley reminds us, when people or jurors are deciding whether to punish someone with death or not, to some extent they're deciding what an adequate payment is to right the wrong that has been committed, okay? So they're deciding on what type of payback would be just. And this just desserts perspective on punishment is well represented in the work of the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant. And he says here, punishment should be pronounced over all criminals proportionate to their internal wickedness. Okay? Proportionate to their internal wickedness. So in our research, we asked the question, could physical features that mark race be a proxy for internal wickedness? And if so, are black defendants who look more stereotypically black more likely to be perceived as wicked and punished accordingly? When we consider real defendants who've been convicted of first-degree murder, who should get life and who should get death? Perhaps an overlooked factor in understanding how the death penalty is decided upon has to do with this notion of internal wickedness. Perhaps still today, American citizens look upon a black face and use the blackness of his physical features as a proxy for internal wickedness, and perhaps they decide to punish accordingly. So we addressed this issue in this next study by using a large data set of death-eligible defendants that was put together by David Baldus and colleagues. We were able to locate the photographs of these defendants in this data set, and we gave these photographs to raters to have them judge the faces on stereotypicality, okay? And these participants had no idea what the study was about or how we got the faces or that the faces were actually the faces of convicted criminals. We just asked them to rate the faces on stereotypicality, and we were interested in whether those ratings could then predict whether the defendant got a life sentence or a death sentence. Now, the data I'm about to show you are for black defendants only, and you can see here that when black defendants who are convicted of killing black victims, you see that there's no stereotypicality effect. The death sentencing rate is exactly the same for those who are low and those who are high in stereotypicality. However, when you look at black defendants who were convicted of killing white victims, there's a huge stereotypicality effect, okay? So looking more black more than doubles your chances of receiving a death sentence. And this effect is significant even though we controlled for factors like aggravators and mitigators and the murder severity and the SES of the victim and the defendant and the attractiveness of the defendant. Black defendants are punished in proportion to the blackness of their physical features. So the next question is, why is this the case? Like, why does blackness matter only to the extent that the victims are white? And at first glance, these results seemed puzzling to us. But, you know, again, it resonates with decades of research demonstrating that convicted criminals are much more likely to be sentenced to death when their victims are white. So perhaps the internal wickedness of defendants matters most when the victims are most worthy of saving. So perhaps this result underscores how people value the lives of whites more than they value the lives of blacks. So in part 2 of my talk, I'm going to present studies designed to look at the most extreme form of black devaluation. And I'm going to argue that black people are not only viewed as criminal, but as somehow less human than whites. Now, of course, the dehumanization of black Americans has been a long-standing issue in this country. In 1934, W.E.B. Du Bois writes about this issue in the foreword to his classic book, Black Reconstruction. And he says here, "It would be only fair to the reader to say frankly in advance that the attitude of any person toward this story will be distinctly influenced by his theories of the Negro race. If he believes the Negro in America and in general is an average and ordinary human being who under a given environment develops like other human beings, then he will read this story and judge it by the facts adduced. If, however, he regards the Negro as a distinctly inferior creation who can never successfully take part in modern civilization and whose emancipation and enfranchisement were gestures against nature, then he will need something more than the sort of facts I have set down." But this latter person, I am not trying to convince. I am simply pointing out these two points of view, so obvious to Americans. And then without further ado, I am assuming the truth of the first. And fine, I'm going to tell this story as though Negroes were ordinary human beings, realizing that this attitude will from the first seriously curtail my audience. One of the oldest race battles that blacks have fought in this country has been the battle to be recognized as fully human, to be regarded not in the in-between status somewhere between ape and human, but to be fully human. And this is an old battle that on the surface at least appears to be largely forgotten. And in fact, when we asked Stanford undergraduates to tell us what social group is associated with apes, most had no knowledge that black Americans are associated with apes. When we asked what animals are associated with black Americans, again, most had no knowledge of an association between blacks and apes. And in fact, in no study that I know about do people express explicit knowledge of a stereotypic association between blacks and apes. Yet in study after study, we're finding that people still today make this association, and this association alters how blacks are seen and treated in the modern world. So we began to test people's implicit association or implicit knowledge of this association by using some of the same paradigms that I showed you earlier. So, for example, in the first study, we demonstrate that the stereotypic association between blacks and apes is strong enough to shape visual attention. In this particular study, we expose people to faces just as we've done in the other studies. So they're, again, exposed to these faces subliminally. Either they're exposed to the black faces or the white faces. And then we have participants perform this degraded objects task. And just like in previous studies, you know, they're shown the objects, they're really degraded, they become more clear. But this time, all of the objects are animals. Some of the animals are apes, like this. Others are non-apes, like alligators and squirrels and elephants, okay? And we hypothesized that participants would be faster to detect the apes when they'd been first exposed to the black faces as compared to the white faces. Okay, so let's look at the results here. So you can see here that when they're judging the non-apes, the race of the face that they've been exposed to beforehand doesn't matter at all. But when they're detecting the apes, it makes a big difference, okay? Simple exposure to the black faces beforehand reduces the threshold at which people can actually recognize these ape images. So the black faces, once again, they're facilitating the detection of the ape images. Now, I have to say that these results just stopped me in my tracks. For the first time in my career, I looked at study results, and I just had to say, have mercy. We kept running the study. We repeated it to make sure the effect was real, and the result was always the same. We tested the association backwards and forwards, and the result was always the same.